Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Swati Biswas from the Department of Islamic History and Culture, University of Calcutta. Today's model to be discussed is Mughal painting during the time of Jahangir, Shah Jahan and Aurangzeb. In the earlier module, we have discussed how Mughal painting has developed from the time of Akbar, and we have also discussed how his predecessor Babur and Humayun introduced the concept of Mughal culture into India. Today's module has the objective of discussing how the Mughal painting took shape during the last three great Mughal rulers. There is a shift from the manuscript to album culture at this point of time. The importance of European painting increases in the Mughal school. The culture of painting declines from the time of Shah Jahan as his interest shifts to architecture, and Aurangzeb, like Babur, was not interested in painting and was too engrossed with political disturbances, and the atelier became weak in production. As a result of which, the atelier fizzled out, but it led to a different kind of a story. The artists and their techniques, along with their skill, went to the different local schools. So we are now going to discuss how Jahangir inherited the atelier and took it to its zenith. The Mughal painting actually reached its excellence during the time of Jahangir. It was the most active phase of Mughal painting. Compared to Akbar, Jahangir was all the more interested in the nitty-gritties of the painting school. It employed the best painters and invested huge sum in the project. The taste of the rulers, of course, shifted from the literary work to albums. The European influence was the most during this time. So, as a result of it, instead of manuscripts being illustrated, this was a time when a single piece of illustration became important for the patron. And all these pieces again were bound in something called album and was enjoyed by the patrons in their private quarters. The Mughal studio copied the European themes but used only the techniques which would be congenial for their style. So, even though there was influx of European painting in the market and in the court, the techniques were not imbibed toto. So what instead they did is they kept their technique alive, only that the subjects, the layout and perhaps sometimes the color schemes were copied. The iconographic factor of the Mughal school remained the same. New elements definitely was added only to enhance the subject, which became wide and therefore again very complex. The style reached its culmination, of course, during the time of Shah Jahan, and it left therefore no scope for further development. And moreover, we have to understand that Shah Jahan personally was not much interested in painting compared to architecture. So the patron's interest somehow lacked. And Mughal atelier from the very first day was actually the interest of its patron. So when the shift happened in interest, somehow the Mughal atelier, painting atelier, declined. The style reached its culmination true, but it is also have to understand the scope became much limited for development. The taste of the ruler shifted from painting to architecture, and this of course added a stringency in its exchequer, and somehow the ruler did not want to experiment further as far as Mughal painting atelier is concerned. The period is marked by a gloss and glitter unlike the earlier phase. So now the illustrations became more expensive instead of becoming more intricate. Aurangzeb was steeped into financial crunch due to political reasons. His personal taste also did not persuade him to invest in the studio, and thus the best of the artists started leaving the imperial studio for the provincial courts, and then a new phase in the Indian painting ushered in, which will be discussed in some other modules. Now let's move to the excellence of Jahangir's period. Jahangir ascended the throne in 1605. Compared to his father, he was less astute as a ruler, but of course, he was illustrious in the sense he was more erudite. But his ascending the throne also brought in certain political complications, and he had no capacity to control that, as we will see in the political modules. But his enthusiasm in painting dated back to childhood, and that excelled when he rebelled and found his own court in Allahabad. This was definitely the aftermath of the activities of the Akbari studio. Like any other prince of the Persianate world, he had his own set of artists and a studio from a very early age. Allahabad actually saw the culmination of the famous Jahangiri studio, in which he intentionally deviated from the subjects and the forms that was the activity of his father's studio. Jahangir was exceptionally interested in painting, and we find that in all the contemporary records, including his own biography, he talks in length about the painting schools. He gave immense importance to portraiture. We have to understand that portrait culture also developed in Europe during this time and excelled. But of course, Mughal portraits were very different from its European counterpart. It was a direct influence of the West, true. And the enthusiasm of the art of portrait, of course, we've seen already started during Akbar's reign, but of course, Jahangir took it to a different level. In Jahangir's palaces and audience halls, European religious pictures were also very popular, though we have to understand their subjects were incoherent at times and emblematic. Jahangir's artists were reputed for making exact copy of the European painting that were gathered in the imperial studio, which may have come as a gift, or maybe they were presented to the emperor, but they were just facsimile copies, and the techniques were never imbibed because the Persian patron, or rather the Mughal patron, never wanted it to be done the way Europeans were doing. They always insisted the paintings to be done in the Mughal format. They were keen on imitation and not always followed the techniques, therefore. It was either a practice that the artist did spontaneously and sometimes ordered by the emperor himself. The incident of copy of a gift made to Jahangir was also referred by Thomas Rowe. He says that within a day, several copies of a painting was done by the Jahangir artist, and it was very, very difficult initially to understand which was the original painting. Jahangir was far from averse to receiving as presents. These were many of the elaborate illustrated copy of Yusuf Zulekha, which was done by Abdur Rahim Khani Khanan. It was gifted to him. It was highly appreciated by the rulers. So we also have this culture of gifting a kind of illustrated copy of manuscripts to the ruler by the very prestigious close coterie of the ruling elites. His influence on the production of book is, however, mostly evident tinkering from the earlier manuscripts, both Mughal and from Persia and Transoxania, ordering miniatures to complete incomplete works, or painting himself or Akbar or his sons into them. So this was a very interesting thing that Jahangir did. He tried to incorporate the faces of the Mughal rulers into the earlier paintings, and therefore we see that even the famous house of Timur has the faces of the Mughal rulers. So it was a kind of incorporation of the time. Now let's move to another very interesting piece of work that was done in Allahabad actually, which is called Jog Bashisht. His interest in Hindu philosophy was very popular. The original manuscript commissions were of course few, but Jog Bashisht, which is dated about 1602 and was done by Allahabad, is something to be remembered for. And this copy of the original Jog Bashisht that was done is preserved in the Chester Beatty Library. The copy is mention-worthy because this introduced a new tonality of color, which became very popular later, which was colder and more transparent compared to its contemporary illustrations. The composition was simple and there was an increased use of wash and line drawing, or what is called neem kalam. We have to understand this concept of line drawing or neem kalam or fine neem kalam was becoming very, very popular also in the Persian schools at this point of time. This evolution shows that the changes that was creeping in the taste of the patrons of both Akbar and Jahangir in the late 16th and early 17th century. For Akbar, on his return to Lahore, we know in 1598, took with him the famous artist from Isfahan, Aka Riza Haravi, a specialist in Neem Kalam from Persia, and also his son Abul Fazl Hassan, who later became one of Jahangir's most important artists. Let's look into the album culture that developed. Aka Riza had been in the service of Akbar since about 1584. His first dated work is the vignettes in the margins of Jahangir's Gulshan album in the Gulista Palace Library in Tehran today. The earliest pages were commissioned in 1599, the vignettes in which they bound so richly and almost to distract attention from the paintings they frame is really interesting. The taste was acquired, of course, by the ruler way back in his Allahabad days and very different from the taste of his illustrious father, Akbar. Jahangir definitely had varied tastes. This varied interest was carried forward from his early youth, not as a rebel ruler, but someone who was interested in painting and had and acquired a taste very different. This interest included calligraphy, particularly the works of Sultan Ali Mashhadi and Mir Ali Haravi, in which he started collecting their work, whose work, of course, had a legendary fame in Persia. He was also interested in the early works of Mughals, including that of Abdul Samad during the time of Humayun. So somehow Jahangir also was interested into looking into the whole school of Mughal painting and how it developed, and it was just not an interest of any ordinary connoisseur. European paintings, of course, was another area of interest which also engaged him. Drawings and prints of religious and allegorical subjects together with the Mughal copies or versions of them were included in his interest. Now, Deccani paintings and few contemporary curious portraits of the time were also included in the albums, and it is not known as to why the Deccani paintings were included in the album. So the scholars believe that Jahangir was also aware as to what was happening in rest of the subcontinent, and he had shown a curious interest in them. So he was also a good collector of painting. Albums of his time and of his successor Shah Jahan, for example, take care to follow that with the result that much of their contents are copies of the works of Akbari or Jahangiri style. So albums also became an area where earlier works could be copied. In these collections, the date when they were actually made was plainly less important, therefore, than the date of the original work. We know that Jahangir was much interested in the philosophy of the religions. Jahangir's interest in Sufism and Hinduism led to the depiction of many illustrations related to the subject in these albums. Now, Christian or Flemish or North German engravings were also executed in the Mughal court, but of course, it did not evoke any literary response in his memoir. So, his interest more was in the philosophy of the subcontinent and not that of Europe, at least what we find from the illustrated works of the time. So, it can be conclusive evidence that in no way Jahangir had any inclination towards Christianity, as some scholars tried to make us believe. By the later part of Akbar's reign, of course, and more so during the time of Jahangir and Shah Jahan, Mughal painting had become, in the widest sense, largely biographical illustrations to the chronicles, portraits, and natural history and biography proper. It started by the depiction of Baburnama and Timurnama, and it moved on then for Akbarnama and then to Tuzuki Jahangiri and later to Shah Jahan's own biography Padshahnama. Now, Baburnama was somehow an interest area of Jahangir, and it also, we know, that started being executed in the court from 1589 onwards. Strikingly, it is not known as to why Jahangir wanted it to be illustrated again. Jahangir had much in common with Babur as far as his taste for nature is concerned. Jahangir transcribed art of the Chagatai text, which then filled the historical gaps where it may have filled the abbreviated Persian translation, and he also wrote his own biography at this point of time, that is Tuzuki Jahangiri, literally meaning the regulations of Jahangir, at least covering the first 18 years of his reign from 1605 to 1627. Tuzuki Jahangiri, in March, he ordered the events of his first 12 Tuzuk to be made as a presentation copy. The first copy, as a part of Persian norm, went to his heir Shah Jahan, or Prince Khurram as he was then known. It is believed that the illustrations to them were not in the text but were bound in separate albums. The front piece was probably done by Abul al-Hasan and Nadir al-Zaman, showing Jahangir's accession. The possessive nature of the illustration is well conveyed by the page in the British Museum showing Jahangir's son Khurram or Shah Jahan being weighed in gold and silver, a famous Mughal ceremony associated with the beginning of solar year. This illustration was done by the famous painter Manohar. The rich garden landscape is therefore mention-worthy. It was first and foremost a portrait of Jahangir, his son, and the important ministers around him. Jahangir pierced his ear at this time as he became a follower of the Chishtiya order after his illness post 1614, and that is also very prominent in the illustration. The illustration was also the celebration of wealth of the Mughals during this time. It showcased the wrappers of cloth of gold, brocaded and silver embroidered silks, all laid out in fine carpet. The illustration also showed fine European glass vessels in agate, and for the first time the Ming porcelain in the Mughal illustrations. Autobiography is classical Islam or medieval Europe was rare. Baburnama therefore was a rare piece of literature. Tuzuki Jahangiri was an important source of information, but it lacked the literary class of Baburnama, as Jahangir lacked the training that Babur had and also his flair for language. Even then, it was an important document. The memoir was personal and very frank, and the records his fascination for opium or drink, which may have been an offense in Islam, but then we have to understand the Mughals were no Islamic preachers and they really never cared for it. Jahangir's affection for his pets and animals and birds in general was very exceptional. Thus, he took interest in illustrating them. Ustad Mansoor, as a painter, was employed by him for this reason, and he was an exceptional painter of his time. Curiosity, it is beyond reckon as to why he commissioned for the illustration of ailing Inayat Khan. So this kind of eccentricity was also something noteworthy. This weird painting was done by none other than Govardhan. There are two copies of it, one in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston and the other in the Baudelaire Library. Jahangir's passion for nature was unrestrained. Like Babur, he was never too occupied to build gardens. His descriptions of landscape show a powerful graphic imagination. His interest was well laid out in the depiction of exotic flora and fauna in the copies of Baburnama made for Akbar. These type of illustrations also appear later in Jahangirnama. Thus, in this mood, a zebra from Abyssinia was illustrated in 1612. He also records of a Peregrine falcon sent to him as a gift which died in the way, but of course he made a copy of it. A pineapple as a fruit which came with the advent of the Portuguese and then made its way to the Mughal gardens. A turkey cock from Goa in 1612 was also depicted. These were all done by Mansoor. A strange tailless monkey was also illustrated by him at this point of time. So, nature illustrations became a passion for Jahangir. Painter Mansoor was famous for lifelike depictions of this sort, and this gave him the title Nadir al-Asar, or the rarity of age. This was the time of natural history painting at its finest. Mansoor is known by his work signed or authenticated by his patron Jahangir or Shah Jahan at times. By the time of Baburnama of 1519, the British Library, he was an established artist and he became popular for his studies of birds and three-figural scenes. The albums of 1599 for Jahangir also has his contributions. His illustrations were copied well during his time by him or his contemporaries and continued to be copied till the 19th century. The constant experimentation during this time posed various problems for the study of the Mughal painting, as it made the volume of the work elaborate and complex. Added to this was his interest in European subject. At the time, some of the versions of the European prints looked like facsimile version of the original, but it was done definitely to please the patron. The Mughal painters' option of modeling, stereoscopic perspective, and the use of sumato and other European techniques for depicting distance by use of color is marked in the treatment of the themes of non-European origin, including natural history, painting for Jahangir, and some European themes showed that they had indigenous innovations of the time. This, to the mind of the experts, led to the decline of the quality from the time of Akbar. The style was a kind of fusion of Indian, Persian, and European altogether. This gave Mughal painting a unique individuality and emotion very rare in contemporary Asia. Now let's draw up as to the painting styles of Shah Jahan and Aurangzeb. Accession of Shah Jahan in 1628 was also remembered for the murky political disturbances. It slackened the expansion of the Mughals. He was then again interested in architecture compared to painting, as discussed earlier. Both these reasons led to the budget curtailment of the imperial studio. Shah Jahan's only major manuscript commission was his own biography, Pacha-nama, which glorified his own reign. The presentation copy of this elaborate manuscript is now kept in the Windsor Castles of the Royal Library. It is dated 1656-57 and it's a magnificent manuscript, but of course the layout is uneven compared to the times. The illustration concentrates on the first decade of the ruler's reign. The reason of this uneven illustration may be due to the fact that the chronicle covered 20 years or so and the illustration was done simultaneously, and the rulers could well feel the pressure of the finances, and thus the illustrations were curtailed later. His tastes deviated to architecture. In the imperial album of the late Jahangiri period was marked by the stylistic unity achieved by his artists, making the illustration of the studio rather more useful to group their work by subject matter, as has been attempted with the illustrations, rather than by individual production. Shah Jahan's studio was the heir to this style, and the changes in its personnel in the 1630 was much gradual. The best example is the Pietradura inlay of Taj Mahal at Agra. It produced the effect which was much brilliant and extra smooth. The Shahjahani albums were famous for its floral margins. The floral designs were accurate in nature mostly. The subject matter became narrower in range. Stiff formal portrait was mostly preferred by the patron. Sometimes new heads were added to the stereotyped bodies, and that somehow slackened the motion of the Mughal paintings for which it was so popular. This was sometimes also misleading. Some paintings does show the ability of the painter to illustrate large group of men, as was done in the illustrations of Shah Jahan's commission work of Darbar in 1628. In many pages executed for Jahangir or copies of them mounted for Shah Jahan lacked the spontaneity which Jahangir insisted. Thus, naturalism of the Mughal painting now was becoming a kind of secondary consideration. The syncretism of the European, Muslim and the Hindu elements, the religious, cultural and stylistic markers which was done under Akbar and Jahangir was becoming more and more absent. This is to some extent reflects the orthodoxy of the ruler. Many artists then moved to the liberal princess like Dara Shikoh, who was unfortunately again killed in 1658. The brilliance and the gloss was kept alive, and perhaps this was the culmination of the Mughal style. It left no room for further development. The painting during Aurangzeb was the ossification of the imperial style, therefore. Innovation in the paintings after Shah Jahan had done on provincial basis in the provinces which had Hindu rulers mostly. So the subjects became Hindu essentially in these local courts. There were often smaller and simplistic versions of the imperial models and developed to become provincial schools thereafter. Fine painting was never only the monopoly of the royal studio. We have to understand in the 17th century, the officials also had their own studio and were able to copy and produce illustrations at par with the imperial workshop. The best example is the studio of Abdul Rahim Khanan. The Freer Gallery in Ramayan, executed in 1589 to 98, is the finest work of his studio. Artists like Mushkin and Qasim worked in it, and these two artists worked for him for 2 decades at a stretch. They participated in the anthology of romances of Amir Khusro and Shahnama. These two famous artists never worked for either Akbar or Shah Jahan for that matter. Jahangir switched his interest from illustrated text to albums and thus dismissed the artists who moved to the provinces and had congenial atmosphere to work and with less pressure presumably. The imperial studio worked under the supervision of the patrons, and thus a change in the patron obviously affected the patrons, the painters. The much favoured artists of Jahangir, Manohar and Bishnodas after the accession of Shah Jahan therefore went off to work with Darashkoh and Jafar Khan respectively. So now let us summarize as to what we have done in this module. Sometimes we understand that the artists who moved from the Mughal court moved to the Hindu courts during this time into the provinces but took the style with them, and thus we have illustrations like the Ragamala series of the Rajasthani school or the Persian style illustrations in the paintings of Golconda and Deccan. The freedom of subject and style for the trained Mughal artists was the new trend noticed from the end of the 17th century. After the death of Aurangzeb, of course, the Grand Imperial Studio was gradually dispersed by the unworthy successors. The library was ruined by the advent and loot of Nadir Shah, and this was a time when the provincial schools flourished and evolved. And it is, of course, a different kind of a story, hence that we will study in the different modules some other day. For further discussion, please log on to the EPG Pathshala website and refer to the text given with this module. Thank you.